Do you want to know how I built this table saw crosscut sled? Well, stick around and I'll show you how I did it. So my plan was to minimize the amount of materials I would have to purchase for this project. And lucky for me, I had an extra piece of 3/4 inch MDF and this lovely piece of melamine that I had just cut off where the table saw is on my workbench. Also, I was very excited to get this package in the mail. RZ Mask was gracious to send me a brand new mask, some new filters, and a hat. Thank you very much, RZ Mask, for sending me these gifts. I've been using your products for a long time, and I will continue to do so. For your nose, gives you really good coverage, and then there's a nice breathable mesh, which is new from their other masks that I used before. But yeah, thanks for RZ Mask for sending me this. I've had others in the past, but this one is definitely an improved design, and hopefully I can get a lot of years out of it. The other one I had for many, many years, got a little storage bag here that I can put the extra filters in, and they also give me a bunch of extra filters. So I've got lots of stuff here for me to use, and I will continue to use it. Great mask. As I mentioned before, I wanted to reuse as much stuff as possible. Had this extra piece of melamine that I cut out of the table saw that I'm using right now. And I wanted to just do a rough cut of what I thought I may need and just clean things up because it was pretty rough because I used a router to cut it out. And then I also have this 3/4 inch MDF that I was able to salvage from this workbench when I added the table saw. So these were two big things, and then I was able to use some other materials that I already had in the shop for me to finish up this project, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the first thing I want to do is clean up this MDF. Since I had it on top of my workbench, it had a bunch of glue splotches and some dents, and so I want to get the sander out, make things nice and smooth so that when I attach the melamine onto the top of it, it will go on nice and smoothly. It's pretty simple to attach all this stuff. I just use some spray adhesive. I put it on both sides, and then I'm able to attach everything together after about 15-20 minutes when things are tacky. I use these strips to put down so that I have some movement and I can figure out how things are lined up so it doesn't stick too quickly. And then as I work my way down, this is just like you would do Formica on a Formica countertop. Just pull those strips as you attach things, and it minimizes the amount of air bubbles between the melamine and the MDF. So now I will cut it down just a little bit more. I put it on the table saw and cut out the extra piece that I don't need, and I also made it a rectangle. I was gonna make it a big square, but the truth is I just don't need that big of a crosscut sled. I just need something that will help me with my next project when I'm cutting out legs, or I want to do some simple cuts and want things to be straight and don't have to sit there and mess around. This table saw is old, like I've mentioned many times before. It's had a good long life. And the reality of it is, it's not the greatest when it comes to precision cuts. So now we're moving on to the front and back fence. We took a couple of pieces of MDF, and of course I had to sand it down to make sure that everything is very smooth. If we don't do that, then when we put this glue down, it's not going to adhere as well, and we'll have a bunch of gaps. Also take my little silicone brush, make sure that we smooth everything out and that we have really good coverage. Try to line things as best as we can before we clamp these down. Now I'm clamping these and I'm going to set them aside and let them dry while I'm working on other things. Also, when you put these together, make sure that you clean up some of this glue squeeze out because it's just going to help you out later on. This is either the back or front fence. I can't remember which one this one was, but basically did the same thing. Put down some glue, cleaned it all up, and clamped everything down. And as you can tell from the previous scene, I am working at night, so I just let this dry overnight and then came back to it the next day. So now I'm taking some of my leftover MDF and I'm cutting a couple of strips. These strips are going to be attached to the bottom of the sled, and this is going to allow the sled to move along the grooves on top of the table saw. Now, I cut these strips, and I'm sure that there's a better way to cut them. At least I kept my fingers away from the blade, but this worked out just fine. And then one thing to keep in mind is that Rockler sells these strips that you can just purchase them. They're aluminum and they work great, but I just wanted to go ahead and cut my own. I may replace them with the Rockler set at some point, but these are working just fine at this point. I'm also marking on the table saw where these strips are going to have to ride into the table saw, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but we'll take a router and we'll route out the grooves in the table to allow the crosscut sled to move past the table saw. So now we add some double-sided tape, and this is going to allow the crosscut sled to attach to these strips in the perfect position. I set up the fence on the right side of my table saw to make sure everything was aligned perfectly, and that way I know it's going to be straight going all the way through once everything is attached. Once everything's attached, we want to mark where we want to put a few screws. Now I'm making sure to put in some pilot holes because these strips are pretty thin and I'm sure they're going to want to split. I'm also putting in a countersink for each one of these screws because the way that these strips are riding in the grooves, if I don't countersink the screws, they will rub, and then number one, it's going to make a lot of noise. Number two, it's going to scratch everything up, and number three, it's just not a very clean finish. So now I'm using my marking tool to mark where these strips are going to have to run into the table. I could use a pen, but the melamine would have just rubbed off, so I used the marking pen instead. I've got my router set up. I use my 90-degree ruler as a guide for the router. It runs pretty smoothly, so I didn't worry about it having to jump over, and I just need to make sure that it's straight. I had to do this a couple times just to make it pretty wide. Once it gets onto the table, I don't really care if there's some movement. It needs to be tight on the table saw, but on the table itself, I just need a place for it to run off and not get caught. And yes, it was that cold that day. I could barely feel my hands at this point. So now it's time to cut some grooves on the top of the table. One of the few items that I did buy for this table that I didn't already have in the shop was some rails for me to attach some lockdowns onto the top of the table so that things don't move around when I'm using the crosscut sled. And the best way to cut these grooves is to put together my dado blades, flip over the sled, run it through to get those grooves in there. Perfect size, and I just had to do that a couple times. One for the left and one for the right, and everything went in perfectly. The next thing I used my dado blade for was to take away a couple of inches of melamine from the top of the crosscut sled. The reason why I did this was because the front and back fence need to be attached, and it wasn't going to be able to be glued onto the melamine. Obviously, it's not going to stick. And number two, I needed a place where it would have a good attachment point and wouldn't move around. So the removal of the melamine was the perfect solution. Gives me a great place for me to glue everything together, and then I can screw everything from underneath. Again, we just use a little silicone brush to make sure everything is smoothed out before we put everything together. I use my 90-degree ruler to make sure it's straight up against the fence, and I also use my T-square to make sure it's at a 90-degree angle. Take a couple of clamps, flip it over, add a couple of screws, and everything is perfectly attached once everything dries. Once again, I'm using a pilot hole for the screws. I'm also going to countersink everything because, again, I don't want any screw heads rubbing on the table saw itself. Table saw is pretty old, but I still want to make sure that things stay clean. So one of the final steps is to attach these T-tracks onto the top of the table saw. I'm going to be using these T-tracks to attach some tie-down clamps to the top of the crosscut sled. Once I place these in here, they're a little bit short, and that's because I miscalculated on the size of these T-tracks, but I really don't need them up against the front fence of this sled, so I really just needed it to be all the way up against the back, and in the front there's a little bit of gap, and that actually gives me a little bit of space for me to be able to move T-screws that are used in these T-tracks to tie down everything. Like everything else, I drill some pilot holes and make sure that I put in screws that aren't going to go through the bottom, because that would be bad and we could scratch up the top of the table saw. Now, I love these little tie down clamps. They're easy to install, they are great quality, and they hold everything down really securely. I've already used this crosscut sled on a couple of things, and they work superbly. And now the very last step is to cut the kerf in the crosscut sled. The kerf is also known as the slot where the blade goes through, but it's called a kerf, in case you didn't know. I didn't know. Had to go look it up, believe it or not. But yeah, so we cut the kerf, and once that kerf is cut, we are all set, and this project is done. Alright, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like I stated earlier in the video, pretty much everything that I built on here I already had in my shop. The only thing that I added were these rails and these lockdowns from Rockler. Pretty inexpensive parts, but if I were to build this from scratch, if I had to go buy the materials at Home Depot, I wouldn't even need a whole sheet of MDF. You can go into Lowe's or Home Depot, and they will sell you like the quarter sheets or half sheets, and I probably would need about a quarter sheet for me to build this, so it wouldn't be very expensive. But if you want to do that, that's fine, but I was just fortunate that I had most of the materials already here in my shop. But other than that, the only thing that you really have to make sure of is just make sure that everything is really square. This table saw that I have is not very forgiving. In fact, this is very high on my list to replace this saw at some point. But for now, I pretty much have to do the best that I can to make sure things are square, and then I have to do a lot of repair work. But I don't remember where I saw it, but somebody had stated that about 80% of woodworking is fixing the mistakes you make, and for me, that's definitely the case. So that's why the table saw is going to be very, very high on my list as a replacement item. Once I get a bigger area for me to work, that's going to be probably the first thing that I get. But we'll continue to work with what I have, and I'll just repair things as I go. Stay tuned for my next project, which is actually going to be a TV table that I have to build for my upstairs. It's a pretty messed up situation that I have upstairs, and I have to do something to make it a lot prettier. But in the meantime, I have another tool that I have to build, which is going to be a slab flattener, because I don't have a very large planer, and so I'm going to have to do something to be able to get my slab flattened out. But that's a project that I'll be working on next, and then we'll start working on our TV table as soon as I get done with that. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you like this video, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe if I've earned your subscription, and if you want to be notified of future videos, don't forget to hit that bell, and we'll see you on the next one.